You think you know the story of island life, but the truth of these ancient Aboriginal people is far richer and stranger than any history book tells. From sacred rituals to daring sea voyages and hidden traditions, their world comes alive in ways you've never imagined. Watch to uncover it all. Under the endless stretch of the Pacific sky, where the horizon blurred into the glimmering surface of turquoise waters, there was an island that, to the people who lived upon it, was not merely a piece of land but the living body of an ancestor. They called it Te Rangio Moana, the heaven of the sea, and for generations it had cradled them in both its beauty and its dangers. The morning sun always came first in a whisper, stroking the peaks of the palms with soft gold before reaching the white sand, and then finally kissing the huts woven of pandanus leaves, awakening the voices of roosters and the rustle of sleeping children who stirred when their mothers began the daily songs of preparation. Life here was rhythm, the tide coming in and out like the pulse of a great heart, the waves carving stories into the shore, and the winds carrying whispers from islands beyond the visible line. To the villagers, each detail mattered. The way the coconut cracked beneath a stone, the scent of smoked fish curling through the huts, the sound of laughter as boys practiced throwing spears into the sand, all these things were threads in the fabric of their world. On this particular morning, a young boy named Cairo awoke to the sound of his grandmother humming a tune older than the palm trees themselves. She sat by the hearth, feeding dried breadfruit chips into the fire, her hair silver, her eyes clouded but sharp with memory. Cairo loved the mornings with her, for she carried the island's stories the way the ocean carried its tides. "Listen," she whispered, as if the smoke itself were her messenger. "The island speaks. The waves told me last night of change. A canoe larger than any you've seen will touch our sands." Cairo's eyes widened, not in fear but in wonder. Canoes were common. Outrigger crafts his father and uncles paddled to fish or to visit neighboring islets. But larger, the thought pulsed through him like the first note of a drum. His grandmother's warnings were not mere tales. She had foretold the last storm when others laughed, and the storm had torn half the coconut grove down. As Cairo chewed on the smoky, nutty breadfruit his grandmother passed him, he looked toward the sea, where the early light shimmered on restless waves, and he felt something stirring beyond sight. The island was alive with preparation, though no one yet knew it. Men set out nets woven with careful knots. Women pounded taro into paste with hollowed logs, the dull thump echoing like a heartbeat through the morning air. Children scampered along the shore, collecting shells that glistened like the eyes of fish. Cairo's father, Tamaroa, a tall man whose skin was carved by sun and salt, guided the younger men to repair a canoe. They worked in silence, sweat mingling with the tang of seawater, until one began to chant, and soon all joined, voices rising and falling with the rhythm of their hands. This was the island's life, every task accompanied by song, every labor tied to spirit. And yet beneath it all was an undercurrent, a sense that something unseen pressed at the edges of their horizon. When midday arrived, the village gathered beneath the shade of the great banyan tree, its roots like the frozen legs of giants, its canopy a ceiling of green light. The women brought bowls of fermented breadfruit, the tang sharp against the sweetness of roasted plantains. Children laughed with mouths sticky from mango juice. Elders sat together, chewing betel nut, spitting red stains into the earth, speaking slowly of weather, fishing, and old battles no child remembered. In this calm, Cairo could not forget his grandmother's words. He looked to the sea again and again, but saw only the shimmer of heat, the occasional leap of a silver fish. Yet the air seemed heavier, as though carrying news from far away. That night, after the meal of fish wrapped in banana leaves and baked in hot stones, after the drums quieted and the moon rose like a pale canoe across the dark waters, Cairo lay awake listening. The surf's rhythm was different. It was not only the familiar push and pull, it was joined by a subtle beat, a thrum not of nature but of something crafted, like the heartbeat of wood against water. He rose, barefoot, silent, and slipped to the shore. There, in the distance, he saw it, not a fishing canoe, not the slim silhouettes he knew so well, but a hulking shadow gliding across the moonlit waves. It moved with confidence, cutting the water with its wide belly, and though he could not yet see faces or hear voices, he felt the air tighten around him. His breath caught. The vision was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He ran back, stumbling through the sand, calling for his father. Soon others gathered, their torches flickering like restless stars, their voices hushed but urgent. The elders squinted toward the horizon, their eyes narrowing. One muttered prayers, another spat into the sea to ward off ill spirits. Tamaroa stood with arms crossed, the firelight etching his face into lines of shadow and resolve. "We wait until dawn," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "If this canoe brings friends, we will greet them. If it brings danger, we will be ready." The night grew long, thick with whispers and unease. Cairo sat beside his grandmother, who stroked his hair with a hand as rough as driftwood. "This is how the world changes, child," she murmured. "Not with storms alone, but with strangers arriving when the sea calls them." He wanted to ask what kind of strangers, but her eyes had drifted beyond him, as if watching memories rather than waves. The island did not sleep that night. Some sharpened spears of bone and obsidian. Some prayed to ancestors, voices low as the hum of insects. Some wept quietly, fearing what might come. The firelight flickered across faces etched with worry, hope, and resignation. And when the first pale light of dawn spread across the horizon, the shadow was still there, closer now, its shape no longer a mystery but a certainty. A vessel larger than any islander had ever seen, with sails that caught the morning wind like wings of a giant seabird. Cairo's heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing his grandmother's warning. He held her hand tightly, though she trembled less than he did. For the first time, he saw fear in his father's eyes, though Tamaroa quickly masked it with resolve. The canoe, or was it something beyond canoe, slid closer, revealing figures upon its deck, their bodies unfamiliar, their gestures strange. And at that moment, as the village gathered in silence, the world they had always known stood at the edge of change. The sea was no longer only theirs. Something vast, unknown, and unstoppable was arriving, and the island, like Cairo himself, held its breath. The sun rose in a blaze of molten orange, spilling across the waves and painting the island's shores in soft fire, and with its light the strange vessel loomed clearly at last, so unlike any canoe the islanders had ever built or even imagined. Its sides towered like the cliffs on the far side of Te Rangio Moana, its sails stretched high like the wings of the sacred frigate birds, and its shadow spread across the water with a weight that made the children fall silent and the elders lower their eyes. Yet despite the unease, curiosity flickered in the hearts of many, for to see such a creation was to glimpse a world beyond the horizon, a world whispered of in songs but never confirmed by sight. Cairo clung to his grandmother's side, his young heart racing as he studied the figures upon the deck, men with garments that shimmered strangely, some pale like bleached shells, others wrapped in colors unfamiliar, their heads covered in cloths or hats that the wind caught, their movements deliberate and filled with purpose. His father Tamaroa gathered the men, speaking in a low voice, reminding them of the balance between welcome and caution, for the ancestors had taught that the sea gave gifts but also tests, and strangers could be either. The women prepared food quickly, laying out fish, coconuts, and roasted breadfruit upon woven mats, for hospitality was sacred even in fear, and the act of offering sustenance could shield one from ill spirits. As the vessel anchored near the reef, a smaller craft was lowered, cutting across the lagoon toward the beach, and the villagers gathered in a semicircle beneath the swaying palms, their bodies painted with ochre and charcoal to remind themselves of strength and lineage, their voices silent but steady, waiting. When the strangers stepped onto the sand, the first thing that struck the islanders was their smell, not unpleasant, but heavy with salt, tar, and something metallic, as if they had carried the scent of distant lands. Within their very skin, they carried objects that gleamed in the sun, long rods, shining blades, and wooden chests bound with rope, but they also carried gifts, beads that glistened like dew, cloth smoother than banana leaves, and strange foods wrapped tightly in leaves. Cairo watched with wide eyes as one of the men bent low and extended his hand toward Tamaroa, a gesture strange yet clearly meant as peace, and Tamaroa, cautious but proud, placed his calloused hand against it, feeling the softness of skin unmarked by years of paddling or fishing. Language was a barrier, yet sound itself became a bridge, the strangers speaking in rolling tones, unfamiliar but not hostile, while the islanders responded with song, their chants low and resonant, carrying the memory of ancestors in every note. Through gestures they exchanged meanings: water for thirst, fruit for hunger, wood for fire, laughter for friendship. The children dared to approach, fascinated by the trinkets the strangers carried, and one little girl touched the fabric of a cloak, giggling at its smoothness, while the man who wore it smiled awkwardly, offering her a small bead the color of the lagoon at dawn. The day unfolded in a haze of wonder and unease, with food shared, stories attempted through movement, and the strangers marveling at the huts, the drums, the nets strung between palms, while the islanders marveled at the iron knives, the carved figures on the vessel's prow, and the sheer size of sails that seemed to capture the very breath of the gods. Yet beneath the surface of this meeting, the elders whispered warnings, for they had seen how even small changes, the planting of a new tree, the arrival of a new family, shifted the island's rhythm, and this was no small change but a wave rising far beyond the reef. As twilight fell, the strangers returned to their ship, promising with gestures to come again, and the islanders gathered around the banyan tree to speak. Some argued that these were messengers of the gods, that their ship was a floating mountain, and their objects gifts from ancestors long forgotten. Others feared they were bringers of imbalance, men who might take more than they gave, who might weave themselves into the island's heart and change it forever. Cairo listened, silent, his eyes fixed on the glowing horizon where the vessel rested like a dark guardian, and he felt torn between awe and dread. That night, the drums sounded softer, and the songs carried a melancholy tone, as if the island itself hummed a warning. In the huts, families ate in silence, the taste of taro and coconut tinged with worry, the familiar flavors unable to banish the unfamiliar shadow that now lingered offshore. Cairo's grandmother told him, as she stroked his hair, that change was like the tide. It could not be stopped, only navigated, and that the islanders must remember who they were. For those who forget their roots drift like canoes without paddles. In the days that followed, the vessel remained, its sails sometimes furled, sometimes spread wide, and its smaller crafts made journeys to the shore, each visit layering the island with new curiosities. Mirrors that showed faces too clearly, tools sharper than obsidian, grains that cooked into strange, fragrant porridge. Some villagers delighted, trading shells, fish, and mats for these wonders, while others grew uneasy, noticing how the strangers asked again and again for water, wood, and food, taking in larger quantities than they gave. There were rumors, too, of young men visiting the ship at night, drawn by promises of adventure beyond the horizon, and of arguments among the elders about whether to embrace these newcomers or send them away. The children, unburdened by fear, mimicked the strangers' gestures in play, laughing as they built miniature canoes in the sand, pretending to sail into the unknown. Yet Cairo, though young, felt the tension building like a storm beneath the calm sea, for he could see in his father's furrowed brow and his grandmother's long silences that the balance of their world was shifting. One evening, as the sunset bled crimson across the sky, the villagers gathered again beneath the banyan tree, and Tamaroa spoke of duty, of the need to protect the island's spirit, its waters, its trees, its songs. But even as he spoke, another canoe approached from the great vessel, larger than before, carrying more men, some with eyes sharper, gestures less gentle, and in their hands objects that glinted too dangerously in the fading light. Silence fell upon the gathering as the strangers stepped ashore with purpose, no longer merely guests but something heavier, something more insistent, and Cairo, clutching his grandmother's hand, realized with a chill that this meeting was no longer only about gifts and friendship but about something far greater, something that would test the island's very soul. The third dawn after the strangers' arrival broke heavy with clouds, a grey veil stretching across the horizon, and the sea itself seemed restless as though echoing the unease that had settled over Te Rangio Moana. The vessel still anchored near the reef loomed in the dim light like a dark guardian, its sails furled, its mast rising into the sky like a spear piercing the heavens, and while children still played along the beach, their laughter was quieter. their eyes often darting to the shadow on the water, for even they sensed that something had changed. The men who had come ashore the evening before carried themselves differently, not with the tentative wonder of visitors, but with the authority of those who believed they belonged, and they brought with them objects no islander could ignore: long rods that spat thunder when struck, knives sharper and heavier than obsidian, cloth dyed in hues brighter than any flower of the forest. Yet they also brought demands, gesturing for more. Water, more coconuts, more fish, more wood for their great floating house, and though the villagers gave as they always had, for generosity was sacred, whispers began to curl beneath the banyan tree, whispers that perhaps these were not visitors but takers, and that once a tide begins to rise it does not stop at the ankle but climbs higher and higher until the shore itself disappears. Cairo watched with wide eyes as his father Tamaroa tried to hold the village steady, leading the men in their daily fishing, showing the strangers how nets were cast and canoes paddled, hoping that sharing knowledge might build trust. But he saw too the lines deepen in his father's brow each evening when they returned with smaller catches, for the strangers' hunger seemed endless. The women worked harder, pounding more taro, roasting more breadfruit, weaving more mats, their hands raw and their voices hushed, though still at night they sang softly to the children, the lullabies carrying the memory of calmer times. One afternoon, when the clouds parted and the heat pressed down like a heavy hand, Cairo followed his grandmother into the forest where she gathered herbs, her steps slow but purposeful, and she spoke to him of balance, of how the island thrived because each person, each tree, each wave took only what was needed, and she warned him that those who forget this balance bring ruin even to the richest lands. Her words sank into him like the roots of the banyan, deep and unshakable, and, as they returned carrying bundles of fragrant leaves, the distant sound of drums reached them, not the familiar rhythm of island song but a harsher beat from the shore where the strangers had begun to strike their own instruments, filling the air with sounds that jarred against the old melodies. That night, as the fires burned low and the stars blinked faintly through the thinning clouds, Cairo dreamed of canoes overturned by waves larger than mountains, of fish fleeing into endless darkness, of voices calling his name from waters too deep to see, and he awoke with a shiver to find his grandmother watching him, her eyes reflecting the starlight, whispering that the ancestors spoke in dreams and that he must remember. The following days brought more tension, for a group of young men from the village, tempted by promises of treasures and the lure of voyages beyond the horizon, began spending long hours aboard the vessel, returning with trinkets, but with eyes changed, filled with restlessness and pride, and some of the elders muttered that their spirits were drifting, unmoored from the island that had raised them. One evening a quarrel broke out when the strangers tried to take wood from the sacred grove where the oldest trees grew, trees believed to be the dwelling places of ancestral spirits, and Tamaroa stood firm, his spear raised not in violence but in warning, his voice steady as he told them that this grove could not be touched, though the strangers retreated. Their eyes were sharp with frustration, and the air between the two peoples grew tight, like a rope pulled too hard. Still, there were moments of fragile peace, children exchanging songs with the strangers, women teaching them how to wrap fish in leaves and bake them in earth ovens, men laughing awkwardly as they tried island dances, their stiff bodies clumsy beside the graceful sways of their hosts, and these moments gave hope that perhaps harmony could be found, yet always beneath lingered the weight of imbalance. One afternoon, as Cairo sat with other boys weaving small nets, he noticed the sea-birds wheeling in frantic circles over the reef, their cries sharp and urgent, and soon the men returned from fishing empty-handed, saying the fish had fled, the waters strangely barren, and the elders nodded gravely, for they knew the sea mirrored the heart of the people, and when harmony faltered, so too did the gifts of the ocean. That night, the banyan tree heard arguments louder than ever before, some insisting the strangers must be embraced for they brought tools and knowledge unknown, others demanding they be sent away before the island itself withered, and Cairo watched as his father tried to bridge the two sides, his voice strong but his eyes weary, while his grandmother sat silent, chewing betel nut slowly, her silence speaking louder than words. The next morning, as the villagers gathered on the shore, another canoe came from the great vessel, carrying not only men, but chests of shining objects they laid out in the sand, blades, beads, cloth, and food unlike any seen before, and though the gifts dazzled the children and some of the women, Tamaroa stepped forward and refused to touch them, warning that gifts could bind as much as chains. Tension thickened in the humid air, and the sea itself seemed to hold its breath, its waves lapping softly as though waiting. Cairo, standing close to his grandmother, felt the weight of the moment press into his chest, and he realized with a clarity beyond his years that whatever choice was made now would shape not only the lives of his people but the island itself. As the strangers gestured insistently toward the sacred grove once more, their voices sharper, their smiles thinner, the drums of the village fell silent, and the entire gathering seemed to hover on the edge of something vast, a moment poised between peace and conflict, hospitality and resistance, belonging and loss, and in that suspended breath the island itself seemed to whisper that change was no longer a distant shadow, but a wave already rising, unstoppable and immense. The fourth part of the story began with a silence that felt heavier than any storm, for after the strangers laid their glittering treasures on the sand and demanded passage into the sacred grove, the villagers did not rush to answer but stood frozen, as if the banyan tree itself had rooted their feet to the earth, and into that silence spilled the softest of waves, the creak of palm fronds swaying in the salt breeze, and the distant cries of seabirds circling above the reef. Tamaroa stood at the front, his chest bare, his skin gleaming with sweat, his spear upright in the sand beside him, and though his voice trembled with the weight of responsibility, he spoke firmly, declaring that the grove could not be touched, for it was not merely trees but the living home of ancestors, and to cut them would be to cut the heart of the island itself. The strangers frowned, their words tumbling in harsh syllables that the islanders could not understand, yet their meaning was clear enough in the tightening of their jaws and the way their hands lingered upon the long rods of thunder they carried. Cairo clutched his grandmother's hand, feeling the roughness of her skin, her knuckles stiff yet strong, and he felt both comforted and afraid, for though she whispered that the spirits would protect the island if the people remained true, he saw in her eyes a shadow that told him even the spirits might falter before a storm too great. In the days that followed, the strangers returned again and again, each time pressing harder for wood, for food, for guides to lead them through the forest, and though small trades still happened, the islanders accepting beads, knives, and cloth in exchange for taro and coconuts, the balance tilted dangerously, for the strangers always asked for more than they gave, and their presence began to change the rhythm of daily life. The fishermen complained that the sea grew stingier, nets pulling up fewer fish, while the women muttered that the breadfruit trees bore less fruit, as though the land itself shrank back in response to the strain. At night, around the fire, the old songs were sung in softer tones, less in joy than in prayer, and the drums that once spoke freely of courage and love now beat slow and low, like hearts weighted with dread. Some of the young men who had gone aboard the great vessel returned with stories of wonders beyond the horizon, lands of endless stone, rivers wider than the lagoon, animals with horns taller than a man. But their words carried restlessness too, and they looked at the island with new eyes, no longer fully content with its size and simplicity. This worried the elders more than the strangers' demands, for a people divided within themselves are easier to sway, and already arguments crackled beneath the banyan tree like sparks before a fire, some saying the island must protect itself by resisting, others saying survival meant adapting and bending. One evening, as a blood-red sunset smeared the sky, Tamaroa stood and declared that the villagers must meet the strangers with firmness, neither violent nor submissive, but he warned that if the sacred grove fell, so too would the spirit of the island, and the people murmured agreement though unease still lingered. Cairo, sitting at the edge of the circle, listened with his young heart pounding, sensing the weight of history pressing upon this moment, as if the ancestors themselves leaned close to hear what choice their descendants would make. The following day, when the strangers came ashore once more, their steps more forceful, their faces harder, Tamaroa and the elders led them not to the grove but to the edge of the lagoon, offering them gifts of roasted fish, woven mats, and calabashes of fresh water, hoping to distract and redirect their hunger. For a time it seemed to work, the strangers laughing, tasting the food, examining the mats, and for a fleeting moment the shore held a fragile peace, with children playing at the edge of the surf while the men of two worlds gestured and smiled awkwardly. Yet even in that moment Cairo noticed one of the strangers watching the forest with an intensity that sent a chill through him, as though the man saw not trees but something he meant to claim. That night, the wind rose sharp and restless, rattling the thatched roofs and bending the palms, and in the flickering light of the hearth Cairo's grandmother told him a tale of an ancient time when spirits tested the people by sending visitors from the sea, warning that sometimes the test was not of strength but of memory, whether the people would remember who they were and what they must guard. Her words lingered in Cairo's mind as he drifted into uneasy dreams filled with waves rising higher than mountains and voices calling him into darkness. At dawn, the strangers returned once more, this time carrying larger chests, which they pried open on the sand to reveal more blades, more beads, and small shining mirrors that caught the sun and scattered its light into the eyes of the villagers. The children gasped in delight, chasing the beams of light like fireflies, and some women murmured in admiration of the cloths, softer than any they had woven. But Tamaroa refused to move forward, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, and he said no to their insistent gestures toward the grove. His refusal sparked a silence broken only by the hiss of waves, and then one of the strangers lifted his rod of thunder slightly, not firing but making his meaning plain, and the villagers flinched though they did not scatter. Cairo felt his grandmother squeeze his hand, and he looked up to see her eyes fierce and wet with pride, as though telling him silently that courage meant standing even when fear was great. The standoff did not break into violence, for the strangers seemed uncertain, perhaps wary of angering a people who still outnumbered them on the sand, but as they retreated back to their canoe, their faces tight with frustration, the villagers knew the reprieve was temporary. That evening, the arguments beneath the banyan tree turned to shouts, with one young man declaring that perhaps the grove was only trees after all, and perhaps it was better to give than to suffer the wrath of thunder rods. But Tamaroa struck his spear into the earth, silencing the gathering with the weight of his conviction, declaring that without the grove they were nothing, just leaves scattered on the wind. Cairo felt the firelight flicker against his face and the truth of his father's words burning inside him. Yet he also felt the dread that came with knowing the strangers would return, and stronger, and that soon the people would face a choice that could not be undone. And so, as the stars spread above the dark lagoon and the vessel loomed like a silent mountain against the horizon, the islanders kept their fires low, their songs hushed, their prayers whispered, for they knew the wave of change was rising, and the night air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when it would break upon them. On the island, the rhythms of life had become something like the pulse of the sea itself, steady and endlessly repeating, yet within those repetitions lay 1,000 small stories, and as the years moved the people found themselves both unchanged and constantly changing, for the children who once played at the edge of the lagoon now rose as hunters and carvers, and the elders who once carried the weight of memory now entrusted their tales to the next generation, ensuring that the thread of their existence would never break, and among them a boy named Kanoa, who had been small and curious when first introduced to the stories of the ancestors, grew into a man who sought to give shape to those stories not just with words but with wood, carving into canoes, into statues, into the walls of the meeting-house, shapes of fish, birds, storms, and fire, because he believed that the island itself spoke through form as much as through sound, and his hands became the tools of that belief, while his sister Lonnie found her calling in guiding the gardens, teaching younger women how to bend and weave vines into fences that kept the pigs out, how to read the soil for signs of hunger or strength, how to bring forth food not only to fill the belly but to honor the earth that gave it. And together the siblings represented two paths of the same spirit, one devoted to shaping what the sea and forest gave, the other to tending what grew in the ground. And in the evenings, when the tribe gathered by the fire, they both told what they had learned that day, and the tribe listened not with passive ears but with intent, for on the island no lesson was ever wasted, and all knowledge belonged to everyone, from the youngest child still unsteady on their feet to the elder whose eyes had clouded but whose hearing remained sharp, and so the rhythm of giving and taking knowledge continued, binding them in a circle that no storm could break, though storms came often, great rolling black clouds that swept across the sea with the fury of spirits, flattening palms, tearing roofs of thatch, scattering the dugout canoes like toys. And in those moments the people gathered together, men lashing down structures with ropes of braided fiber, women holding the children close, songs of protection rising to fight against the howl of the wind, and when the morning sun came again, when the ocean stilled and the wreckage lay plain, they rebuilt, always rebuilt, with patience and quiet determination, never cursing the storm but treating it as one of many forces with which they shared the world, neither friend nor foe but simply there. And Kanoa in those times carved storm spirits into the beams of new homes, believing that to give them form was to acknowledge their presence and earn their respect, while Lonnie led the women to replant fallen gardens, salvaging roots, finding seeds, teaching children to see renewal where others might only see ruin, and this way of living with rather than against became the heart of their survival, a lesson passed from mouth to mouth, gesture to gesture, until it became instinct, until it lived in their bones, and beyond storms there were other challenges, of scarcity when the sea grew quiet and fish swam deeper, of quarrels among families when resources felt thin, of strangers arriving from other islands with new songs, new ways of fishing, sometimes bringing friendship and trade, sometimes envy and conflict, but through it all the tribe returned to the fire, to the circle of voices, to the patient weaving of stories and decisions until balance was found again, and in this Kanoa saw the meaning of his carvings deepen, for wood could crack and fade, but the act of shaping it, of capturing in a single figure the story of a hunt, the outline of a bird, the fury of a storm, became itself a ritual of remembering, while Lonnie came to see the soil not just as ground but as a book, each sprout a word, each harvest a chapter, and she taught others to read that book as carefully as they read the lines of a song, and in their lives the island continued to breathe, endless cycles of planting, building, fishing, feasting, mourning, and rejoicing, until the outside world pressed closer, when sails appeared on the horizon, unfamiliar shapes carrying people who spoke with strange sounds and offered tools of metal in exchange for food, and the tribe greeted them with caution and curiosity, remembering the ancestors' warning that not all gifts are truly gifts, yet also knowing that to close one's heart was to turn away from the vastness of the sea, and so they listened, traded, learned, but never abandoned their circle, never let their stories fall silent, never let the rhythm of their days be drowned by voices from elsewhere, and though the strangers left, and others came again in different seasons, bringing more goods, more questions, more temptation, the people returned always to what anchored them, their fire, their chants, their carvings, their gardens, their children's laughter, for in that heartbeat lay the truth that they belonged not to the storms, nor to the strangers, but to the island itself, and so life went on, a story without end, written in waves and wood and earth. In the seasons that followed the coming and going of the strangers, the people of the island found themselves speaking often about what it meant to live as they always had, while also brushing against a world that seemed larger than the horizon they had always known, and the elders said that the sea was both barrier and bridge, and so long as they remembered that balance they would not be lost to themselves, and in those years Kanoa's carvings grew taller and more complex, for he began to raise great wooden poles near the shoreline carved with patterns of birds in flight, fish chasing the currents, and men and women holding hands around a fire, and these poles were not only works of beauty but also markers for the canoes returning home, symbols that reminded the fishermen that no matter how far they went the island called them back, and at the same time Lonnie guided the community in creating gardens that reached further inland, weaving irrigation channels from bamboo and coconut husks so that water was guided to the driest patches of soil, ensuring that no family went without taro, yams, or bananas, and the people worked together in these efforts, each task a song a reminder that no hand was ever alone, and children learned early that their voices joined in chant were as important as the hands that built and planted, for in their culture every sound carried power and every action carried meaning, and though storms still came, though hunger sometimes tested them, their way of life deepened into a rhythm that felt eternal, until one day a new group of strangers appeared not on sails, but in great vessels carved of hard wood, with tools sharper than bone or stone, with garments dyed in colors the islanders had never seen, and unlike the first visitors these strangers came not only to trade but to stay, setting up shelters of their own and marking spaces on the shore as if they too belonged, and this unsettled the tribe, for the elders warned that those who do not ask to belong may never truly belong. Yet they also feared that anger would invite conflict, and so the people chose to observe, to weave caution into their days while still tending to their gardens and fishing in their waters, and in the evenings Kanoa carved the shapes of these strangers into wood, not to honor them but to remind his people that memory was the strongest defense, while Lonnie reminded the children that no matter who came they must first care for the soil, for the earth was the true ancestor who would never leave them, and so they held to their rituals, the fire circles, the chants to the sky, the offerings to the sea, even as they watched the newcomers hunt without ceremony and cut trees without asking permission, and in this contrast they saw the difference between those who live with the island and those who try to master it, and though unease grew they also found strength in their unity, and when the newcomers tried to lure some of the younger men with bright objects and promises of travel, the elders gathered the tribe and told stories deeper and older than any gift, reminding them of the first canoe that came to the island, of the first fire lit, of the barn that tied them to every tree, every fish, every stone, and so the young men stayed, tempted but not broken, and Kanoa carved those stories into a great wall in the meeting-house, so that even if words were forgotten the images would remind them, while Lonnie planted a sacred grove where only children could play, teaching them that joy itself was a duty to the ancestors, and so the people carried on, wary but unyielding, and though years would bring more strangers, more challenges, the heart of the tribe remained with the island, for they knew that as long as they listened to the waves, tended their gardens, and sang their chants, no outside power could erase who they were, and thus their story continued, a circle without end, echoing across generations like the tide. As the moons turned and seasons cycled, the people of the island began to realize that their greatest strength lay not in resistance alone, but in remembering and adapting without forgetting, and so the elders called for a great gathering at the meeting-house, where the carved wall of Kanoa stood gleaming in the firelight, and every family from the smallest child to the oldest grandparent brought with them an offering of memory, a shell from the shore, a leaf from the high forest, a stone warmed in the sun, and as they placed these before the fire, the elders spoke of how memory was not only in stories but in touch and taste and scent, how the sea breeze carried the same salt as the tears of their ancestors, how the taro fields carried the labor of generations of hands, and how the songs in their language held within them the echoes of countless voices. And so they decided that they would not let the newcomers or the growing changes wash these things away. Instead they would weave them deeper into life, and each evening the people gathered in small circles around their cook fires, not only to eat but to share tales, to sing lullabies, to recite the names of the stars, and in this way children grew up with the constellations as old friends, recognizing the fisherman's net in the sky or the canoe of the gods rising before dawn, and meanwhile Lonnie tended her sacred grove, teaching girls and boys alike that to plant a tree was to tie your breath to the breath of tomorrow. And so, when sickness came again carried by yet another band of outsiders who thought little of washing in the river or tending to the wounds they left unclean, the people remembered her teachings, using herbs of the forest, coconut oil, and the smoke of healing leaves to fight the fevers. And though some were lost, the tribe endured because they did not forget the plants that spoke to them, and Kanoa's carvings became more than beauty, they were records. Each groove a story of what had been seen, what had been overcome, what must not be erased. And in time young apprentices came to him, asking to learn the chisel's language, to carve not only animals and spirits, but the faces of their people, so that in centuries to come no child would look at the wood and wonder who they were. And in this way art became shield and song became weapon and memory became survival. Yet it was not only hardship that filled those years, for joy too grew as strong as sorrow, and feasts marked the turning of the seasons, with pigs roasted in earth ovens, taro pounded into smooth paste, sweet bananas caramelized over fire, and fish wrapped in leaves and steamed until tender, and the people sang as they ate, their laughter carrying across the lagoons, and sometimes even the newcomers joined, curious and uncertain, and though the islanders did not fully trust them, they shared food, for to deny food was to deny humanity itself. And perhaps in those small exchanges the beginnings of understanding were born, though fragile and fleeting, and so life on the island became a dance between preservation and change, between fear and generosity, and the elders said this was the nature of the tide itself, to come forward and retreat, to offer and to take away, and as children grew into adults they carried both the caution of their parents and the curiosity of youth, daring to sail further, daring to trade with care, daring even to speak the words of the outsiders while never abandoning their own. And in this balance the tribe found a way to remain, and as the fire burned low at night and the last songs faded into the dark, the people lay down with the sense that they were both ancient and new, that their ancestors walked with them and their descendants waited within them, and though shadows of change lingered on the horizon they were not afraid, for the island itself was their heartbeat, and as long as the waves touched the shore their story would not end. And yet beneath that calm surface a question stirred like a storm waiting to break. What would happen when the strangers no longer wished to share but to claim, when memory alone might not be enough to protect the land, the food, the very soul of the people? And it was this question that the elders left hanging in the air, unspoken but heavy, like thunder that had not yet sounded. When the time finally came that the newcomers no longer wished simply to share the shoreline, but to claim the island itself, the people felt the weight of generations press upon them like the deep silence before a storm for ships larger than any they had seen anchored in the bay, and men stepped onto the sand with iron in their hands and laws in their mouths, declaring that the island was no longer the tribe's but belonged to a distant king whose face none of them had ever seen, and whose name carried no meaning among the palms and breadfruit trees. And for a time the people stood in stunned quiet, their chants caught in their throats, their fishing nets left hanging over the canoes, as if the very sea waited for their answer. Yet the elders whispered to each other that the island could not be owned, for it was alive, and living things belonged only to themselves, and so they gathered the families and decided that resistance would not be fought with the newcomers' tools, but with memory, with persistence, with a refusal to forget. And while the strangers raised flags and built walls of stone, the islanders slipped deeper into the forest, tending sacred groves in secret, holding ceremonies beneath the moon where no foreign eyes could see, and teaching the children the words of their ancestors more fiercely than ever before, so that though the new laws rang out on the shore, the old songs still echoed under the canopy, and in the caves carved by waves. And while some were forced to work for the strangers, carrying timber or fishing not for their families, but for the foreign tables, the people wove defiance into their work, singing their chants under their breath, humming lullabies as they carried burdens, so that even in servitude they remained who they were. And the strangers did not understand how strength could hide in silence, but the islanders knew that silence was like the tide, it could retreat only to return stronger. And meanwhile Kanoa, now old and bent but steady of hand, continued to carve, but he no longer set his work in the open. Instead, he and his apprentices hid their carvings in caves, in hollowed tree trunks, in places where rain and wind might weather them but never erase them, and each carving carried not only the images of ancestors, but also the truth of the present, the faces of children taken to serve on ships, the sorrow of forests cut without ceremony, the resilience of mothers weaving mats while teaching ancient words. And though Lonnie too had grown older, she still walked the paths of a sacred grove, guiding grandchildren among the trees, teaching them which bark to boil for fevers, which roots to chew for strength, which blossoms to offer to the sea when asking for safe passage. And she told them that to touch a leaf with respect was to declare that you belonged not to a king across the ocean, but to the land beneath your feet. And so through her the children understood that survival was more than breath, it was memory embodied in every act. And though hardship, deep and famine struck when strangers hoarded food, storms grew fiercer as forests thinned, sickness spread more often still, the people endured not by fighting with weapons, but by refusing to surrender their soul. And with time some of the strangers softened, curious at the resilience of those they had tried to master. Some even learned words of the island tongue, tasted the feasts, sat at the fires, and for a moment cultures brushed against one another like waves, touching yet never blending. And from those small exchanges came children who carried two worlds in their eyes, and though many elders feared this as the end, others whispered that perhaps it was a bridge. And so the island changed yet endured, and as generations passed the flags of kings shifted, the walls crumbled, the ships came and went, but the island remained, and so did its people, carrying forward songs that outsiders never fully understood, planting gardens where no flag could root, carving faces in wood that still watched the sea. And so the story of the islanders reached into the present day, where in the markets of modern towns one can still find carvings echoing Kanoa's hand, and in the chants sung softly at festivals one can still hear the cadence of voices that first rose by the lagoon, and in the recipes of roasted pig and pounded taro shared at gatherings one can still taste the resilience of a people who refuse to be erased. And if you walk the shore at night and listen carefully, the waves seem to murmur the old names, carrying them across the water, as if the sea itself is determined never to forget. And in that whisper lies the truth, that though history may press like a storm and strangers may claim with laws and flags the heartbeat of a people bound to their island, cannot be silenced, for as long as there are children to sing and elders to remember, the circle continues unbroken like the tide eternal. And so ends the telling of this chapter, though the story itself goes on as it always has and always will. The story of the island and its people does not end where the last chant faded into the trees, nor where the last carving was hidden in the hollow of a sacred tree, nor even when the flags of faraway kings ceased to flutter on the shoreline, for history is a tide that recedes only to return again with new shapes, new shells, new debris, and new gifts. And the islanders learned through centuries that to endure was not to remain unchanged, but to carry the flame of memory through the winds of change. And so the epilogue of their story is not a single moment, but a weaving of many generations, each adding their thread to the great mat of existence, so wide it stretches from the first canoe that touched the sand to the children who today look out at the sea from schools built on stone foundations that once belonged to strangers, and ask their grandparents about the old songs and the old words, and are taught that they live in two worlds but carry one heart. And if you walk through the villages now, you will see how the ancient and the modern entwine like vines around the same tree. For in the early mornings, before the sun lifts fully from the horizon, fishermen still push their slender canoes into the surf, just as their ancestors did centuries ago, yet beside them larger boats with motors hum, impatiently ready to haul bigger catches for city markets. And when the men return at dusk, you will hear laughter as children run barefoot across the sand, their hair smelling of salt and smoke from their cook fires. Yet some of them carry in their pockets small glowing devices that connect them to distant places their ancestors could not have imagined, and while these devices speak in tongues of other lands, the children's songs at night still rise in the island's own language, stubborn as the tide itself. And in kitchens you will smell the same roasted pig slow cooked in earth, ovens taro pounded to paste, bananas grilled in leaves, fish steamed with herbs. Yet beside these dishes there may now be tins of food from ships or noodles bought at ports far away, but no meal is complete unless the family gathers around the mat, sharing food with hands and voices, so that eating remains ceremony as it always has been. And in schools children learn not only the numbers and letters of the wider world, but also the constellations of their ancestors traced across chalkboards as carefully as they were once traced with a finger against the night sky. And elders still gather to remind them that the fisherman's net in the heavens is no less real than the equations in a book, for both are patterns to be understood and passed on. And though roads now cut across parts of the forest and houses of concrete rise where once only palm and thatch stood, the sacred groves remain protected by law not written by kings, but by the islanders themselves, who fought to preserve them as heritage and as memory. And in those groves Lonnie's teachings live on, for healers still gather leaves, bark, and roots to prepare remedies that modern doctors sometimes shake their heads at, yet quietly admit have power. And when fevers strike or wounds resist healing, it is to those healers that many still turn. And so the island has become a place where the past and the present sit side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, like two waves colliding, but always with the understanding that one cannot erase the other. And in the art that fills the markets and hangs in galleries abroad, Kanoa's legacy breathes still, for his descendants carve not only birds and fish, but also new forms, blending old spirits with modern lines, telling stories of both ancestors and grandchildren, reminding all who see that culture is not fossil but flame. And those who visit the island sometimes remark that in the eyes of its people there is a depth that comes from having weathered storms not once, but endlessly, from having seen outsiders arrive with weapons, flags, machines, and promises, and yet still singing, still carving, still planting, still laughing. And in this resilience lies the heart of the story. But the epilogue does not stop with resilience alone, for as climate shifts and seas rise, the islanders face again a challenge that echoes the old ones yet feels new, for the tides that once carried canoes now threaten to swallow parts of the shore, and storms that once passed in a day now linger for weeks. And so the people gather once more in meeting houses to chant and to plan, not only with memory but with science and knowledge from across the ocean, combining the wisdom of ancestors with tools of the present, building barriers of stone and planting mangroves to hold the land, listening to both the chants of old and the forecasts of satellites. And once again they remind their children that survival is not only about enduring what comes, but about remembering who you are while you endure it. And in this way the circle widens to include not only the island but the world itself, for scientists travel from distant nations to learn from the islanders how to live with the sea, not against it, how to plant not only for harvest, but for healing, how to chant not only for ceremony, but for unity. And the islanders welcome them, cautiously sharing knowledge as their ancestors did, but also guarding the sacred truths that cannot be traded for coins or grants, for some knowledge belongs only to the soil, the sea, the spirits, and those born from them. And in the evenings, when the sun bleeds into the horizon and the sky blushes with fire, the people still gather around fires to eat and to sing, and in their songs you hear the entire story woven together: the arrival of the first canoe, the laughter of children chasing crabs on the sand, the sorrow of trees cut without blessing, the joy of feasts, the fear of strangers, the resilience of memory, the merging of worlds, the defiance of silence, the endurance of culture. And when the songs fade and night deepens, the ocean continues its whisper, carrying the voices of ancestors across the waves, reminding the living that the story is not theirs alone, but belongs to all who came before, and all who will come after. And so the epilogue is not an ending, but a reminder that stories live as long as they are told, and the island story is still being told in every carving, every chant, every meal, every storm weathered, every child born. And if you listen carefully, even far away, you may hear in the rush of waves, or the rustle of palm leaves, an echo of that story, calling you to remember that. The earth itself is alive, that land and sea cannot be owned, only honored, that survival without memory is emptiness, but survival with memory is life. And so the island stands not just as a place of palms and lagoons, but as a testament to the resilience of human spirit, to the endurance of culture, to the truth that even in the face of conquest and change and rising tides, the heartbeat of a people cannot be silenced, it can only be carried forward, sung again, carved again, planted again, whispered again. And thus the story of the islanders continues without end as the tide itself eternal.